Hello, class. Today we're going to do our unit review for Unit 4, which is over the Civil War. So let's look at a few of the main characters. The first thing we're going to look at is Ulysses S. Grant, who is the leader of the entire Union Army. He doesn't start off that way. He is one of the generals for the Union early in the war, and he has a lot of success in the West. He wins important battles at Shiloh and Vicksburg, and he shows a lot of fight in himself. And he does lose a lot of soldiers, and he gets a lot of criticism for that. But Lincoln looks at him and says, "I can't spare this man. He fights. He's not afraid to go into battle fighting, even if that means that he's going to lose some soldiers." So he becomes the leader of the entire Union Army. After they had gone through other leaders like George McClellan, who's going to run against President Lincoln in 1864 for president. After his promotion, he goes to take on Robert E. Lee in Virginia. He eventually defeats him at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, and that's going to conclude the war. And he's later going to become president of the United States. His number two man is William Tecumseh Sherman, and he played important roles with Grant in Vicksburg, which again was the turning point in the West. When Grant was finally given overall command of the Union Army, Sherman was given his old position as commander in the West. And eventually, he is brought into Georgia to break the Confederacy's back by destroying Georgia. And he goes on to capture Atlanta during the Battle of Atlanta. And then he takes his forces and he marches across Georgia in what's known as Sherman's March to the Sea. And on the way, he is destroying as much as he can in terms of infrastructure, things like bridges, things like railroads, telegraph lines, and things like that. He's burning down any factories. There weren't a lot of factories in the South, but Georgia had the majority of what they did have in the South in terms of industry. So he eventually makes it to Savannah on December 22nd, 1864. He decides not to burn down Savannah and instead presents it to Lincoln as a Christmas present. As Sherman marched across Georgia and destroyed the railroads, one thing that he liked to do is he would heat up the railroad ties, and then he would wrap them around a nearby tree or telegraph line and make them unusable. And as you can see, the way it would be wrapped around, like that one right there, it looks like a tie. So they called them Sherman's neckties. Now, looking at the other side, Confederate General Robert E. Lee was the leader of all the Confederate forces. He was so well known. He had been the captain that captured John Brown. Remember, the man that took the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It's known as the sectionalism guy because they thought he was a hero in the North and a traitor in the South. Robert E. Lee was the captain who captured him. He was very well known, very well respected. They knew he was a brilliant military tactician. And he had been offered the position of leader of the entire Union Army by Abraham Lincoln, but he turned it down, of course, because he is from Virginia, and he said, "I can't raise my sword against my people in my home." So his soldiers followed him dutifully until he was forced to surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, and that's going to end the war. His number two man was General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, also a brilliant field commander, able to defeat much larger forces like Lee was, and stretched this war out much longer than people thought it would. But after the Battle of Chancellorsville, or in the middle of it, or in the midst of it, he was moving, and he accidentally got shot by some of his own men. He gets hit in his left arm. They have to amputate it, and but however it was too late. He gets very sick and he dies. When he was killed, It was a big blow to Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee said that while Jackson had lost his left arm, he had lost his right arm because Jackson was seen as his main man. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederate States of America. He's the counterpart to Abraham Lincoln, who was the president of the United States of America. Jefferson Davis was a very intelligent man. He had been to the military academy, West Point. He had served in the Mexican-American War, as all of the other generals had as well. And he was a political man. He had served as senator from the state of Mississippi. He resigns when Mississippi secedes from the Union, and he is elected to be the new president of the Confederate States of America, or the president of the Confederacy. And he was pretty successful early on, but you have to understand Jefferson Davis's predicament is that he had a confederacy, which is a loose union of states that all want to be independent, yet he's supposed to be trying to control this entire war effort where all these states wanted to do their own thing. Very difficult thing to do. But he did as best as he could with that. But as we had talked about with the Articles of Confederation way early on, we used to have a confederacy. The original 13 colonies before the Constitution, when we were under the Articles of Confederation, we were a confederacy, and it was too weak. Shays' Rebellion showed us that. And that's why we moved more towards federalism and a more centralized government with our Constitution. So he was in a mess, and it was something that had been tried before and just didn't work. Some of the important battles of the Civil War, Fort Sumter is where the first shots were fired. Remember SAVGA? Looks like Savannah, Georgia. S is Fort Sumter. A is Antietam. Antietam is the bloodiest single-day battle. Vicksburg is what we're talking about right here. It is one of the last big Confederate holdouts in the West. After Grant wins at Vicksburg, this turning point in the West, then they have control of the Mississippi River. The Union has control, which is essentially going to cut the Confederacy in half. So that's why Vicksburg is so essential. Also, the Anaconda Plan. This picture that you see here represents the North strategy to defeat the South. And an anaconda is a constrictor. It chokes off its prey. And as you can see here, the blockade of the South is what happens in the Atlantic Ocean around the tip of Florida and into the Gulf of Mexico. There are ships out there blocking the South from being able to trade with other countries. And that's going to eventually shut them down from being able to get the things they need. Also, the head of the snake here is trying to take the Mississippi River, and the tail is trying to take the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia. So that is what the Anaconda Plan is all about, just choking the South out, and eventually they won't be able to fight anymore. The G in the SAVGA is Gettysburg. Gettysburg is the bloodiest three-day battle. Antietam is the bloodiest single-day battle. And it's where General Lee tries to invade the North and take the fight to the North. He figures, we've done all this fighting in the South. Let's go fight in the North a little bit and tear their land up a little bit. Maybe the people will get tired of seeing it, and they'll, force their leaders in the North to just give up. It was a bloody, bloody battle. It was decisive, because the Confederacy had been talking to England and France, trying to get them to come into the war and help them out. After the Confederacy loses Gettysburg, ain't going to happen. The French say once and for all, okay, you lost this big battle. It's not going to happen. The casualties were really high. The Union lost 23,000 soldiers. The Confederacy lost 28,000. One of the big maneuvers that they tried was a division of General Lee's under a general named General George Pickett, and he attacked this one spot that Lee thought was going to be weak, but it wasn't, and basically Pickett's entire division was slaughtered. So they were very, very brave in that push, but it wound up being disastrous. So after Gettysburg, you can pretty much bank on it. The North is winning this war after the South had won for so long. The Battle of Atlanta is another big battle where Sherman was basically destroying the city and every little bit of infrastructure he could find, all of their little factories and all of these things. He had come out of Tennessee and Lookout Mountain, and he pushes the Confederate Army back into Atlanta, and eventually Atlanta is going to fall. After that, he begins his march to the sea to Savannah, destroying all that he can along the way, and eventually that's going to destroy Georgia's will to fight and the Confederacy's will to fight as well, since Georgia was the Empire State of the South, and that's where what little bit of industry the South had was. The Emancipation Proclamation is also very important, and I need to mention before I move on, I said the SAVGA. S is Fort Sumter, A is Antietam, the bloodiest single day of the war. V is Vicksburg, which is the turning point in the West. Now the Union has control of the Mississippi River. G is Gettysburg, bloodiest three-day battle, and the turning point in the East, because now the Union's winning the war and Europe is not going to come in and help out the Confederacy. And the last day is Appomattox. Don't forget that, because that's where Lee surrenders. So there's some way for you to remember that. But the Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order that was issued by President Lincoln in 1863. If you would have asked one of the Union soldiers what the cause of the war was before the Emancipation Proclamation, the answer invariably would have been to preserve the Union, basically to keep the South from leaving and to keep the United States whole. It's hard to get people to fight for a political cause like that. They were having to draft soldiers in the North, and many Northerners didn't care. They said, if the South wants to leave, let them leave. But they didn't want to fight. That's why they had the New York draft riots. So after the Emancipation Proclamation, it's going to change really the cause of the war for the North. After the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, if you'd ask a Union soldier, they'll probably say we're fighting to free the slaves. What it basically did was it freed the slaves on paper in the states that had already left the Union, in the states that had seceded from the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to any of the slaves in anywhere else in the South, including the border states. So, like Missouri and Kentucky and West Virginia, they could keep their slaves, but the other slave states were supposed to give up theirs. Now, the problem with this is that Lincoln did not have control of the southern states at this time. They had left the Union. So while it may have inspired some slaves to escape off their plantations and run up north, initially it really has no effect at all. The main thing that you need to remember about the Emancipation Proclamation is it gives the war a new purpose. It used to be to preserve the Union. Nobody wanted to fight for that, really. So now the new cause is to free slaves. Now, freeing human beings, people can get hyped up and excited about that. So the Emancipation Proclamation does not free all the slaves. What frees all the slaves is one of the amendments that was passed during Reconstruction, which was the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery once and for all in the United States of America. It's now illegal to own any slaves in the United States. The 14th Amendment was also passed, which gives those former slaves citizenship and equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment gives them the right to vote. And that is just black men the right to vote, not women. Women can't vote until the 19th Amendment, no matter what their color of skin is. So then we go through the period of Reconstruction. It ends with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876. He takes office 1877. A deal was made, and the troops are pulled out of the South. And then our era called Jim Crow begins with the black codes and keeping African Americans inferior, all the way up until the modern day civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Don't forget about North versus South in terms of comparative resources. We call this economic disparity. Also, we refer to this as industry versus agriculture. You can see very plainly looking at these numbers here, the Union has the advantage in just about every possible way. I mean, 2.5 to 1 in terms of a ratio in total population. For every one person the South has, the North has 2.5 people. Now, how do you have half a person? Don't worry about that. That's just a ratio, okay? But there's over 2 people for every one in the South, okay? The male population, that's mostly what fights in the war, is the male population, right? So the North has the advantage there. They've got the wealth, the railroad mileage, merchant ship tonnage, naval ship tonnage, factory production, textile goods, iron, coal, firearm production, farm acreage, animals, livestock, wheat production, and corn. The only thing the South has on the North, cotton production. Kind of hard to fight a war with cotton, isn't it? Thank you very much. That's going to conclude this lesson.